Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Now, Rosie, give us the latest from Brussels and what you can tell us about this extraordinary meeting that is likely to happen any moment now.
Well, an extraordinary meeting in really extraordinary times. We've heard from many leaders here in Brussels today saying this is a very dark day for European security. That meeting, which was called impromptu, so it's among all 30 NATO allies, has just wrapped up, and the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg spoke to press. He described this as a very brutal attack, and it was certainly a very sobering situation. Now, the news from that meeting is that NATO has activated what it calls its defensive plans. Now, those are basically shrouded in mystery. We don't know exactly what they entail, but we know they were drawn up in 2014 in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. We understand the idea behind them is to give more flexibility to NATO's top military commander to take action. So NATO is a defensive alliance, and we understand it plans to beef up its troop presence on the alliance's eastern flank. So those are countries, for example, including Poland. What is not included is Ukraine, because Ukraine is not a member of the alliance. So the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg highlighted that there will be no NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine, regardless of what this rather dire turn of events, certainly in his assessment, which certainly was a very sobering one today in Brussels.
In fact, a lot of world leaders coming out in condemnation of what we are currently seeing in the Ukraine. Talk to me about the details that are coming through in terms of how NATO is likely to, support, the European Union at large, planning to support Ukraine. Just what are some of the details? Because we know that there has been criticism that just the first installation of sanctions imposed on Russia, with some saying that it's just not enough.
You're quite right. That has been a criticism, and the loudest critic was Ukraine itself. We heard the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky just over the weekend there at the Munich Security Conference asking for greater sanctions in advance to try and deter. Now, that move was not taken, but we did have an announcement of EU sanctions yesterday. That was only in response to Russia's recognition of these two breakaway regions, so not in response to this attack. We expect a big further rollout of sanctions today. That's something that EU leaders will be discussing this evening at an impromptu summit in Brussels. They will be all heading here for these really crunch talks. Now, when it comes to supporting Ukraine, NATO, that defensive alliance, NATO allies have been sending weapons to Ukraine. They've been sending field hospital, military assets, equipment. But as I mentioned, they will not be sending their troops because Ukraine is not a member, and that means it is not party to the alliance's collective defence deal, which is a sort of one-for-all deal, meaning that any NATO ally that feels whose security is threatened can expect help from the others. Now, when it comes to the European Union, it has announced further financial support will be available for Ukraine. That's in addition to a 1.2 billion euro support package that was already released in the last few weeks. So certainly we heard lots of expressions of solidarity with Ukraine, of solidarity for Ukraine's territorial integrity, which NATO and the European Union both say has now been breached again.
And now, of course, as we know, one of Russia's demands throughout this crisis was that Ukraine be barred from ever joining the NATO alliance. Just what are the prospects for Ukraine's membership of NATO?
That's certainly a question that the Ukrainian government will be asking. This has been a very searing criticism toward NATO we've heard this morning. Some critics are saying, Ukraine has essentially now been subject to this attack because of its aspirations toward joining NATO and toward joining the European Union. It must be said that NATO has consistently said that it would not comply with this Russian request or demand to bar Ukraine from ever joining the alliance because it believes that's up to the 30 NATO allies and Ukraine to decide and not Russia. However, the actual prospects for Ukraine joining have always been quite slim by most analysts. From most analysts' perspective, that's because there are a lot of things Ukraine would need to first fulfill, some criteria, including reforms in the country before it would actually qualify for membership. However, we did hear just in the last hour or two from both the NATO alliance and the European Union saying they hear these ambitions from Ukraine towards aspirations toward membership of these organizations, and we certainly will hear from the leaders of some of those Eastern European and Baltic countries some strident calls to give a stronger European perspective for Ukraine, a stronger idea of how that path toward membership of these international organizations could in fact be laid out, because for now that path remains very unclear.
Rosie, as we wrap up our interview, just give us a picture of what is happening on the ground where you are, just in terms of how, ordinary citizens are reading what is happening currently in the Ukraine.
Well, that's a great question. I must say I was on my bicycle riding to work today, and of course life seems to go on here. People are concerned though. Here in Brussels, we're quite far from Ukraine, but there is certainly concern about what measures Russia might take as counter sanctions. We know the EU is going to be slapping major sanctions on Russia, additional sanctions, and of course no sanctions come without pain. So that means certain industries will be affected. That means perhaps energy prices could be affected if there is a cut off of Russian gas supplies. So there definitely are fears, and beyond that on the ground in terms of institutionally, I'm right here in the middle of these two major institutions, the European Union and NATO, and they are just scrambling to provide a response to this. There are emergency meetings taking place left, right and centre. We'll have a meeting of all 27 EU heads of state and government in Brussels today. They were only here last week for the European Union summit with the African Union, in which President Ramaphosa took part. They did not expect to be seeing each other again so soon, but they are here this evening for crunch talks to try and plot their way forward and their next move on this most complex of geopolitical chessboards, in which of course people's lives are at stake.
Rosie, thank you so much for your analysis and update. That's where we have to leave our conversation for this afternoon. Thank you so much. All right, Rosie.